Hi, I'm Brian from Reason Test Prep. In this video, we're going to talk about how to choose between the GMAT and the GRE. The first thing that you need to ask yourself is, how sure are you that you want to go to business school? So the GMAT is the traditional business school admissions test, and the GRE is now accepted at all business schools. So it's a good alternative. But if you're not sure that you want to go to business school, then you'd definitely be better off taking the GRE because you won't be able to use your GMAT score for any other type of grad school. Whereas if you decide later on, you know what, I actually, not sure if I want to do an MBA, maybe I'm going to do a master's in journalism or I don't know, so, any other field, even PhD, something like that, even law school. Most law schools now take the GRE. So, then definitely the GRE would be a better option. So, if that's the case, if you're not 100% sure that you're going to go to business school, absolutely the GRE. If you definitely are going to go to business school, then we kind of move to the next step of, okay, now how do I decide? So the second thing is that you should understand that business schools seem to have no preference for GMAT or GRE, so you don't have to really worry about, okay, I think the business school is the GMAT is the traditional business school admissions test, so I better take the GMAT. That's just not really the case anymore. I say seem to have no preference because you may hear things that, traditionally, I think when the GRE was first accepted by business schools, they did seem to have a preference for a GMAT score. Although you may also have heard things like, well, business schools don't have to report their GRE scores, so if you're not going to have as high a score, then a GRE is a better score to have. I think at this point, it seems like they just don't really have a preference. So I wouldn't really, lean towards the GMAT just because you assume that that's the test that they want to see. So I would kind of take that factor out of it. So what do you do? I mean, really the first step, once you've decided, definitely you're going to business school, is to take an official GMAT and an official GRE. So on MBA.com for the GMAT and on the ETS website for the GRE, and compare your scores. Now, comparing your scores is actually much harder than it used to be. We actually have an article on our website, and there'll be a link in the notes below the video on the YouTube channel, on our YouTube channel. So you can go to the article, and some of what I'm describing or what I'm about to describe is on there. But basically, there is an ETS published a tool that compared GRE scores to GMAT scores. So it's an older tool, and this is completely shunned by the makers of the GMAT. They would argue that you can't compare a GRE score to a GMAT score, but obviously business schools have to do that, so they are doing it. And I think that ETS comparison tool is a pretty good tool. So let me just say a little bit more about that. So first of all, it converts a GRE score to a classic GMAT score. So on the old scale. So unfortunately, what you have to do is you have to do kind of a double conversion, is convert your GRE score to a classic GMAT score, and then convert that classic GMAT score to the current scale. It's a little bit of a workaround, but it's not that hard. On the MBA.com website, you will find the conversion for the classic GMAT to the current GMAT. So it's not that hard to do. Now, how accurate is it? So we here at Reason Test Prep actually did a whole kind of a deep dive into comparing scores and comparing percentiles, and sparing you all the details of it, I'll just say that tool is pretty accurate actually. So once you go through that conversion, it'll give you a pretty good idea of where, how the scores stack up. It's also not a bad idea to see what scores schools are, what the average score is at these schools, so that you have some frame of reference. You will find that with many schools, the GRE scores that they're asking for are slightly below the equivalent GMAT score. So that's maybe makes it a little bit easier to try to hit the GRE mark that you might need to hit. But I wouldn't read too much into that. If you're coming from a finance background, they're going to be expecting, a high quant score in particular. Now, obviously, if there's a clear winner, right, when you take these these official GMAT and official GREs. If the GMAT's way better, if the GRE is way better, that probably is the end of the story. But I wouldn't just compare the scores. So that's kind of the next thing is and especially if they're close. Often they're pretty similar. Often they're not very good, either one of them. And you're gonna be like, oh man, I'm in a terrible spot. Don't worry though. In the beginning, most people start with a pretty low baseline. But yeah, if you're not sure which way to go, if the scores are pretty close, you want to think about what tests you might do better on after you do your prep. So an example of this would be vocab. So the GRE has vocabulary, the GMAT does not. And, in the beginning, most people don't have a great vocabulary. Almost everyone really needs to study vocabulary for the GRE. So you might do very poorly on the GRE verbal section, but, if you did great on reading comp, but poorly on the vocabulary-based questions, then, you might say to yourself, well, look, like, I could study a lot of vocab. I'm good at memorization, and if I did that, I'm gonna do much better on these particular types of questions. So ultimately, I think I'll do quite well on the GRE verbal section. So yeah, so you want to try to think about not just what is the score in that moment, but what is it likely to be, after you do the prep, and is there certain aspects of one test or the other that you could see, either being difficult or not difficult, down the line after you do prep. And that really leads to the next point, which is, I wouldn't just pick the test that feels easier. You really want to think about which test suits your strengths. So the GRE will feel easier to most people. The quant section in particular is easier, I think, by most people's judgment than the GMAT quant section. So most people walk away from the initial diagnostics feeling like the GRE was just easier. I would say the verbal section, I think, is probably a bit harder. But anyway, overall, people tend to feel like the GRE was a much easier test. Here's the thing. You're being compared to the same cohort of people who are applying to these schools either way, right? So whether they're submitting GMAT scores or whether they're submitting GRE scores, you still have to outperform that same cohort of people. So, if the GRE, felt easier to you, or if it is easier, let's just say objectively it's easier, well, it's going to be easier for everyone, right? So you don't want to, it's not really helpful to just say, oh, well, this is the easier test, let me go for that one. Again, at the end of the day, it's really about your percentile and how you outperform or don't outperform the types of people who are applying to the schools that you're applying to. So, so again, you want to really think about what are your strengths and weaknesses, and how do those connect with the two tests. So for example, the GRE has a calculator on the quant section, the GMAT does not, right? So, at first you might be like, oh, that's great, I love having the calculator, but again, everyone's going to have the calculator. So the question really is, in which setting are you at an advantage relative to other test takers? So, having a calculator is great for everyone, but if you're someone who's great at mental math, well, then you might be better off, you might be in a better position to outperform others on the GMAT where no one has a calculator, right? So those are the kinds of things you want to think about. Okay, and then I want to just finish with some, insider tips here about just things that I or we here at Reason Test Prep have noticed about the tests, and that might be helpful in helping you make the decision. So first of all, the GMAT Quant section, as I said, is definitely a bit harder, and you can almost think of it as like it has a higher ceiling, right? So you have to be able to get up to kind of a higher band of difficulty on the GMAT Quant section than you need to be able to do on the GRE. So that might feel like, oh, well, why would I want to do the GMAT? Well, if you're someone who can get really hard questions right, then that's to your advantage, right? You might find even the hardest things on the GMAT approachable, even if you're getting them wrong initially. So then, there are people who are not going to get those kinds of questions right. If you're someone who thinks, you can ultimately, then that might play to your strengths. The GRE quant section, on the other hand, is more punishing on careless errors because the questions tend to be a bit easier. So it's like every question you get wrong tends to hurt more. So if you're someone who, if you're like, okay, this felt easy, but you made a lot of careless mistakes and missed a lot of questions, not because you didn't know how to answer them, but because you're just prone to making careless mistakes, then yeah, again, the GRE might not be the best fit for you. Second thing is that the GRE verbal, the GMAT verbal section is a bit easier, I would say, most people find, than the GRE verbal section. In particular, the reading comprehension. I think most people find the GMAT reading comprehension to be easier, and the GRE reading comprehension to be a bit harder. But the GMAT verbal section is definitely a bit more logic based, because half the questions essentially are these critical reasoning, logic based questions. The GRE has a little bit of that on the verbal section, but very, very little. On the what it lacks in these logic-based questions, it makes up for in vocabulary-based questions. So the GRE is a little bit more open to memorization, and in particular, vocabulary. So if you're someone who can just, learn thousands of words, that might play to your strengths. Next thing is, if you're on a very short timeline, the GRE might be a better option, because the GMAT is just a slightly harder test to prepare for. You have 3 sections instead of 2, right? You have Quant, Verbal, and Data Insights, whereas on the GRE, you just have Quant and Verbal. Yes, you have an essay, but that takes minutes to prepare for. And then, furthermore, the Data Insights section has 5 separate question types, 4 or 5, depending on how you're counting. So that's a lot. I mean, altogether, the GMAT actually has 8 different question types, and the GRE, depending on how you're counting it, let's say has, maybe 5. So it's just the GMAT's just a harder test to prepare for. So if you have a very short timeline, the GRE might be a better option. And I'd say, yeah, I mean, if after all this, you've tried everything to figure out which test is a better option for you, you're really just sitting on the fence, then I would say the GMAT might be the better choice, because, well, a couple reasons. I mean, I guess one main reason really is that it's harder to pivot from the GRE to the GMAT, I would say. It's much easier to pivot from the GMAT to the GRE. So if you've prepared for the GMAT and it's just you're not quite getting there, you're not quite hitting the score that you want to hit, once you've done all that prep, especially the quant stuff, it's really a pretty easy pivot to the GRE. Obviously, you're going to have to learn vocabulary because that's not on the GMAT. But aside from that, you're really in a pretty good position to pivot and pretty quickly take the GRE. And that's something that we do a lot with people. I mean, we deal with people who believe they should take the GMAT. We believe they should take, we thought they should take the GMAT. We, help prep them for the GMAT. And after, a couple tries, they just weren't quite getting the score that they should be getting, or that we thought they should be getting, or that they want to get. And, we'll pivot, do the GRE. Sometimes it's as few as a few weeks, 3 weeks, let's say, of, pivoting, memorizing a lot of vocab, getting familiar with the GRE, and then taking the test. And I mean, yeah, we've seen people in less than a month pivot and then get a great score on the GRE. So if you're really on the fence, I would say probably better off going for the GMAT. But hopefully you can make a decision. I mean, most people usually have a clear preference after they've gone through all the steps that we've talked about and considered all these factors. Okay. Anyway, I hope you've found this video helpful. If so, please feel free to subscribe. And if you know of anyone else you think might find it helpful, please feel free to share it with them. Thanks again for watching.